If you had to choose one word or one phrase to describe what you think or what you feel when you look in the mirror, what phrase would you choose? Or what word would you choose? I'm convinced there are some people that are kind of like Narcissus from Greek mythology. If you know the story, he was walking along one day and he walked past this small pool of water and he saw his own reflection. He was so handsome that he fell so deeply in love with himself that he couldn't bring himself to walk away from his own reflection. And the way the story goes, he stayed there so long that he eventually died and became a flower. But I'm not sure that's most people's experience. I think most of us have some other words that we probably think of, some other phrases that are not so flattering that we use to label ourselves. Maybe for you it's words like disappointment, average, out of shape, older, isolated, boring, unattractive, unwanted, or uninteresting. Then there are some other phrases that are a little more debilitating but are no less prevalent in our culture. Words like ugly, stupid, loser, failure, repeat offender, worthless, hopeless, quitter, abandoned, or even worse. And you probably have your own list of words or phrases that you use subconsciously to label yourself whenever you see yourself. And it's no wonder we do this when you consider the fact that we now live in a world in which we're constantly comparing ourselves to the unreal and the unattainable. You probably had this experience. Maybe you have a day where you're feeling pretty good about yourself. You know, your hair is falling in the right places. You've dieted all week and you're down a couple pounds. Maybe you even worked out earlier in the week. So now every time you walk past a mirror, you find yourself flexing just to check the progress. Don't act like you've not done that. I know you have. You're feeling pretty good, but then you make the mistake. You pull out your phone and you get on Facebook or Instagram and you see a heavily filtered, perfectly curated picture of somebody that you know. And even though you know that they don't look anything like the picture that you're seeing in real life, it still causes you to step back a little bit and think, man, I cannot compare to him, or I can't compare to her, or I wish I looked more like whoever it is. Elena Rossini is an Italian filmmaker and photographer, and she spent the last several years exploring the effects of Instagram on our culture and on our own psychological well-being. She wrote an article titled The Great Instagram Illusion. I want you to listen to what she wrote. Here, these are her words. She said, what is most insidious is that Instagram has the veneer of being a fun photo-sharing app. But in reality, most of its users play it as if it were a competitive video game, whose ultimate objective is to grow one's popularity. The workings of the algorithm are mysterious, but what performs well on the platform are idealized, highly stylized photos that look like they could be culled from a glossy fashion or lifestyle magazine. Real is out, hyper-perfected is in. Isn't that a great line? She goes on, this is causing an epidemic of stress and anxiety in teenagers and young adults who feel like they don't match up to the thousands of images they see every day, starring not just celebrities, but the hyper-perfected highlight reels of their friends' lives too. Now, there's one thing she got wrong in that. She narrows it down to teenagers and young adults, but the truth is this affects all of us at some level. We find ourselves surrounded by artificially perfect people who are always posting about their artificially perfect lives, and then we look in the mirror and we're immediately confronted with our own imperfections. See, the problem when you look in the mirror is that there are no filters, and what you see is what you get. So what's the answer to all that? Should we just, delete all of our social media, turn in your device, all of us become Amish and just live life like that? Or is there a better path forward? Is there something else that we can do? If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Psalm 139 in the Old Testament. What you find there is an ancient worship song written by an Old Testament hero named David. He's the guy that sort of everybody wanted to be. And as you work your way through these verses, you'll see that David is writing this from the perspective of someone who had a deeply personal relationship with God. And we could literally spend just weeks working our way through this sort of verse by verse, but for our purposes today, there's just three things that you already know that my suspicion is you've probably forgotten that if you can remember these on a regular basis, it'll change the way you feel about yourself whenever you see yourself. But before we get to those three reminders, there are two just sort of big, overarching themes that David hits on that I want to make sure you get. These are not on the outline. They won't be on the screen. But if you'll just follow along with me, I think maybe this will be helpful. Psalm 139, verse 1. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. First thing David says here, he reminds us that God knows everything. Now, in our hearts, we know that. We know that God is omniscient. We know that there's nothing that happens in our world that escapes his notice. But if you'll notice what David does here, he takes it a step further. He says, not only does God know everything, God knows everything about you. Verse 1, he says, you have searched me. And in Hebrew, it's the same phrase they would use to describe an excavation. Just like an archaeologist learns to dig under the surface of the dirt to see what's been covered up, God sees through all the different layers of our hearts. He sees through all the different layers of our lives, and he knows what lies under the surface of our hearts. He knows what time we go to bed. He knows what time we get up in the morning. He knows what time we're supposed to get up in the morning, and he knows how many times we hit the snooze button in between. He knows what you're thinking. He knows what you're feeling, and before a word ever escapes your lips, he knows what you're going to say. Now, most of the time, we don't even know what we're going to say. But God knows what we're going to say. There's nothing that we've done, there's nothing that we'll ever do in the future that he doesn't already know about. He knows everything there is to know about us, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. Now, look at verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. So not only does God know everything, David also says that God is everywhere. Not only is he omniscient, he's also omnipresent. That means there's nowhere that you can go to escape God's presence. When you get up in the morning, he's there. When you go to bed at night, he's there. When you go to work, he's already there. When you go on vacation, he's there. When you're at the lake, when you're hanging out with your friends, when you're at the ball game, on those nights when you're tossing and turning and you can't sleep, he is already there. When you go to work tomorrow and you're halfway through the day and you're not sure that you can make it through the rest of the day, much less the rest of the week, he's right there with you. Now, when you get to verse 13, there is this shift that takes place in which David goes from talking about these big, huge, overarching themes, and he brings it down to just a micro level so that people like you and I can start to wrap our minds around what he's saying. And he applies the truth of who God is, the God that knows everything and the God that is everywhere, to the reality of who we are. Check this out, verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. 3 reminders, stuff you already know, that if we can just remember them, will change the way we feel about ourselves whenever we see ourselves. Here's the first one. David says, you have been carefully designed. Now, sometimes we get so caught up with what the outside looks like that we forget about everything that's going on inside of us, everything that's happening with our bodies at any given moment. Now, the truth is, most of us, we get a new iPhone, we get a new laptop, we're pretty excited about all the stuff that's going on, all the different features, but the truth is, none of that stuff can compare to what's happening inside of your body. Just think about what's going on with your body right now. I did some research this week. Did you know that your body is made up of 100 trillion cells? And according to the people who study this kind of thing, every minute you have 300 million cells that die and are then replaced. All day long, it's just this constant process of repairing and rebuilding. Or what about your brain? The scientists tell us that our brains are made up of 80% water. But even in spite of that, there is enough storage capacity in your brain for you to hold 5 times as much information as an entire set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. 5 times. That doesn't mean all of us are using all that storage capacity, but it's at least available. Or how about this? Did you know that your heart creates enough pressure to pump your blood through 60,000 miles of veins and capillaries that work their way through your body? In just one day's time, the blood that's inside your body travels a total of 12,000 miles. Now you hear that, and it's no wonder that we're all so tired. You think about everything that's going on. Probably the most complex part of the human body is the eye. That's the one part of the equation that evolutionists say they can't explain. Do you know your eye can distinguish up to 1 million different colors? And it can take in more information than the largest existing telescope. That doesn't even take into account the 400 functions that are being performed by your liver, or the capacity of your lungs to push oxygen into your blood, or the incredible amount of information that can be determined by just a microscopic sample of your DNA. How about this? A lot of times when I tell people to turn in their Bible, they pull out their phone and they're on their phone. And everywhere you go now, you see these touch screens, right? Everything is a touch screen. But even the most sensitive touch screen can't compare to your skin. Listen to this. Each square inch of your skin includes 4 yards of nerve fibers, 600 pain sensors, 1,300 nerve cells, 9,000 nerve endings, 36 heat sensors, 75 pressure sensors, 100 sweat glands, 3 million cells, and 3 yards of blood vessels, every square inch. One doctor wrote, "The skin is a miracle of engineering. It waterproofs the body, blocks out and destroys harmful bacteria, regulates temperature, and continuously communicates with the brain." I mean, it's no wonder. That's just a small sample. It's no wonder that David said, hey, we don't even understand everything that's going on with our bodies. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. I love this quote from Augustine. He wrote, "People travel to wonder at the height of the mountains, at the huge waves of the sea, at the long courses of rivers, at the vast compass of the ocean, at the circular motion of the stars, and yet they pass by themselves without wonder." You know, the most complex thing you've ever seen is what you see when you look in the mirror. Did you know that? Now, I want you to go back and look at some of the phrases that David uses to describe how God created us. He writes, "You knit me together in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made, when I was put together, when I was woven together." He's using the language of an artist. So according to David, not only is God an engineer, he's also a master artist. That's why Paul said in Ephesians 2:10, we looked at it last weekend, he says, "For we are God's handiwork." And that word handiwork literally means masterpiece or poem or artwork. A masterpiece is what an artist produces. And according to the Bible, that's us. We are God's handiwork. We are his masterpieces. Now I've got a picture that I want to show you. As you know, 2020 has been a sort of crazy year. Every industry was affected. I don't think there was any industry that was spared. And one of the industries that was hit really hard was the art industry, and especially these auctions that they have. The painting that you see on the screen behind me is called the Triptych inspired by the Orestia of Aeschylus. I'm not going to say that again. I hope you got that. Aeschylus was a Greek mythological character, and this has something to do with him. And according to the New York Times, the painting that you see behind me is the highest selling auctioned off item in the art world in 2020. It sold for $84.6 million at an auction back in June at Sotheby's in New York City. Now I hear that number, 84.6, I think, man, that's an insane number. But the spokesman for the art auction house actually said that was a disappointment. They thought it would go for more. So that got me thinking, what is it that determines a piece of art's value? So I started reading about the world of art valuation, because I don't know about you, but like when I look at this, you may feel differently, but I don't automatically think, boy, that's incredible. You know what I mean? It doesn't really connect with me. Priceless is not the word I would use to describe that. So I got to looking, what is it? So just like any other market, there's a lot of different things. The size of the painting is important, the quality of the painting, what kind of condition the painting is in, the provenance of the painting. Can you trace back where it's been and make sure it's not stolen? Then if you can get the artist to sign, a certificate of authenticity, the value goes way up. So all of that comes into play. But the one thing more than anything else that determines a piece of art's value, you know what it is? It's the artist who created it. I was reading about this. They said, point blank, they said that an impressive piece, a really impressive piece by a lesser-known artist will be worth less than a less impressive piece by somebody who's well-known. In fact, one art appraiser, he summarized it this way. He said, in the world of art, big names equal big numbers. So you look at this, you think, well, that's okay. But the reason it was so valuable is not because it's so captivating. It's because it was painted by a British guy named Francis Bacon. If you go back and look at his stuff, sells for crazy numbers. Back in 2014, he had one look a lot like this that sold for $142 million. Now, I'll be honest with you. There are days, and you've probably had these days, when I look in the mirror and my reaction to what I see is similar to my reaction to this painting. I'm not all that impressed. Sometimes I look at myself like, boy, this is just not connecting with me. It just doesn't look like this is all that well put together. And you've probably had the same experience. But it's on those days that it's important to remember that your value is not determined by the quality or the condition that you're in. Your value is determined by who created you. Your value is determined by the artists that put you together. And according to what David says, you've been carefully designed, not just by a top-notch engineer, but by a master artist. And so you hold a value that never fluctuates. Doesn't go up and down by what you see in the mirror. Doesn't go up and down by what you see on the scales. It's not like the stock market. It's not up one day and down the next. And it has really nothing to do with how you feel about yourself when you see yourself. It's all about the artist that created you and put you together. Now, here's the second reminder. It's so important. He says, not only have you been carefully designed, your life has been intentionally planned. Let's check out verse 16. He says, your eyes saw my unformed body, and all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Now, in our culture, we have this never-ending debate that comes around every political season about when does life begin. But according to David, your life started long before your mother ever knew she was pregnant. And long before your heart ever beat for the first time, long before your lungs ever captured their first breath, God not only saw you, but He also knew everything about you. In fact, He had searched out your life, and if you believe what David said, God knew so much about you that He went ahead and He put together a plan for how your life would unfold. Now, some of you hear that, and you immediately think, well, hey, if this is the plan, then I want my money back. Because this is not what I signed up for. And for some people, that's sort of a natural response. When we're young, we all have these dreams of what we think our life is going to look like, things that we hope come to pass. And then you get to a certain point and you realize that some of those dreams might not come to fruition and the reality starts to set in. So some people, they're younger and they dream about finding their soulmate. They're going to live happily ever after. And then they find themselves unexpectedly single. And they're not sure what the next move is. A lot of people grow up and have this vision. They're going to work this job and they're going to love it. They're going to build this lucrative career and they're going to change the world. And then they hit a certain age and they realize that they're stuck in a dead-end job. A lot of people get a little older. They start moving towards the back end of their career. And they're thinking about their retirement. They're going to move to the beach. They're going to travel the world. They're going to live the good life. And then through different circumstances, sometimes it's bad investments. Sometimes it's financial missteps. They reach a point and it feels like it would be easier to secure a trip to the moon than it would be to retire comfortably. And sometimes it feels as if God's plan is different than our plan. And one of the things that we sometimes get confused is this whole idea of God's sovereignty or God's plan, and when it's balanced against our own free will. See, the truth is that just because God has a plan for your life doesn't mean that He's going to force you to follow that plan. You have free will. He gives you freedom to make your own decisions. And sometimes we make bad decisions. Sometimes we take wrong turns. And over time, those things compound, and they can throw a wrench in even the most carefully laid plans. Just look at the example of the guy who wrote what we've been reading this morning, Psalm 139. David, if you know his story, you know David lived an incredible life. He was a prophet. He was a poet. He was a musician. He was a fearless warrior. He eventually became the king of a great nation. As I said earlier, he's the guy that everybody wanted to be. But even in the midst of all of those impressive highs that were part of his story, there were some pretty dramatic lows. There were some big ups and downs, man. Family dysfunction, adultery, murder. I mean, at one point, he's leading a conspiracy to have somebody killed. He's later betrayed by members of his own family. I mean, just like us, there were periods in which his life, it felt really good, but then there were also some periods when it felt like things had gone completely off the rails. You read through the Psalms, a lot of that's what it's about. It's just him responding to when life goes off the rails. But the other thing he makes clear, if you read through the Psalms, is that it was during those periods of his life that he was closest to God that things tended to go best. In fact, there seems to be this connection that you see illustrated in each stage of his life, in which the closer he is to God and the more he listens to God's voice and the more he follows God's plan, the better things go. But the opposite of that is also true. The further he drifts away from God and the more he follows his plan instead of God's plan, the worse things tend to go. That's why when you get to verse 23 of this chapter, he ends it with this prayer. I want you to look at it with me. Verse 23, he says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Now, you first read that, it's kind of strange, right? I mean, why would you invite the God who already knows everything about you and is already located everywhere that you've ever been and everywhere that you'll ever go? Why would you invite the God who already knows everything to search you? I mean, if he already knows, what could there possibly be left to uncover? But the mistake we make is we read this from God's perspective. The truth is, God already knows. What David is asking is that God would reveal it to him. He knows that God already knows. He wants to know. He wants God to take a look in his heart, to look through those layers, to dig into who he is and see if there's anything that might pull him away from God's plan. See, at this point in his life, David is so committed to staying in the center of God's will and following God's plans for his life that he doesn't want to take the risk that there might be anything in his life that might cause him to miss God's plan. Now, if you were to look back over your life, my suspicion is you would probably admit that it was during those periods when you felt closest to God that things tended to go best. And it's when those periods when you get a little further away from God that things tend to go off the rails. And the challenge in that is you have to figure out a way to remain. John 15 uses the word abide, to stay connected at that level where you can recognize his voice and you can follow him wherever he's leading you. That brings me to the third thing. This is so important. You were carefully designed. Your life has been intentionally planned. And you have the promise, believe it or not, of God's continued presence. In verse 7, David says there's nowhere he can go to escape God's presence. Then you skip down to verse 17. Listen to these words. He said, "How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. One of the things that David acknowledges that we've all felt is that sometimes it's a little overwhelming to try and figure out where God's leading you. It's a little overwhelming to try to discern what he's asking you to do. And even though you might be able to memorize, 5 times the Encyclopedia Britannica, that's nothing. I mean, that's not even a grain of sand compared to the mind of God. And if you're like me, you turn on the news and you see all the stuff, man, that's happening around the world, around your world, and it's a little overwhelming. It's hard to make sense of it. You look at everything that's happening to you and around you, and that can be overwhelming too. Some of you are in situations where your mind is it's spinning in 100 different directions, and it's no wonder if people just knew everything that you were dealing with. But even with all of that, there's one phrase that David uses at the end of verse 18. So important. Here's what he says. When I awake, I am still with you. David came to a point in his life where he realized most important thing is not having all your questions answered. It's not always figuring out, what's next, what's after that, what's the next step to take. It's not just seeing, clear paths and open doors and blue skies and sunshine. David came to a point where more than anything else he realized it's about remembering who created you and who's with you. On the good days, he's there. On the bad days, he's there. On the day you were born, he was there. In fact, before you were born, he was there. And when you get to the end of your life and your heart pumps that last beat and your lungs capture that last breath and your eyes close for the last time, he'll be there. On those days when you look in the mirror and you're pretty impressed and you feel pretty good about what you see, he's there. On those days when you look in the mirror and it's all you can do to keep from turning your head because you're so discouraged, he's still there. If you had to choose one word or one phrase to describe what you see when you look in the mirror, what would you choose? One of the dangerous things about labels is that if you carry them around long enough, they move from being descriptive to becoming prescriptive. See, labels have a way of becoming identities. And at some point, if you carry a negative label long enough, it stops describing your past and it starts determining your future. And you've known people that have done that. How many people have you known they labeled themselves at some point in their life? They begin to view themselves as a loser. And eventually they start believing it. And so what happens is they keep finding new ways to lose. How many people have you known that just defined themselves and saw themselves as an addict? And then if you believe that long enough, pretty soon that becomes your identity and you give up any hope of ever being clean. Or people who describe themselves as unwanted and unloved. And pretty soon they start believing that, and so they find new ways to torpedo potential relationships. And what happens is all of those things become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like you're living in a prison that you created. That's the bad news. But here's the good news. Labels can change. They can. One of the things you discover as you read through the story of Jesus' life is that he specialized in changing labels. You see it on almost every page of the Gospels. The sick become well. The crippled become whole. Those who had previously been excluded are all of a sudden included. The uninvited become the guest of honor. Orphans become members of the family. Losers become leaders. Slaves become sons. The guilty are forgiven. The weak become strong. The isolated become members of a community. Those living in bondage experience freedom. The unloved become loved. The unwanted experience what it's like to be chosen. The corrupt become incorruptible. Sinners become saints. The hopeless become hope-filled. And those who feel worthless experience what it's like to feel priceless. I want you to listen to these words from Romans 8 from Paul. He wrote, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by Him we cry, Abba, Father." The Spirit Himself testifies that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs. Heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. I want you to stand with me. If I don't miss my guess, some of you here this morning, some of you watching, probably been carrying around some pretty negative labels, maybe for a long time. And maybe for you, it feels like you're wearing this invisible name tag. And every time you look in the mirror, you see it. Every time you walk in a room, you're convinced that everybody else can see it too. And just like those name tags you sometimes have to wear on your shirt, every time you pull it off, you can feel the residue that's been left behind. And every time you think you've gotten rid of it, you look up and there it is again. I want you to know it doesn't have to be like that. Labels can change, labels can be discarded, and they can be removed, but it won't happen by trying harder. It won't happen by reinventing yourself. It won't happen by your willpower. It'll happen only through the power of Jesus to free you from the prison that you live in and change the name that you've most likely given yourself, or maybe that somebody else has given you. So we're going to have an invitation song just like we do every Sunday. And I want to explain it clearly because sometimes there's some confusion. If you're here, we're inviting you to respond in whatever way feels appropriate to you. There's no right or wrong way to do this. If you want to pray with somebody, David and I would be honored to pray with you. We'll be up here on these front rows. You can come. You can sit down here, and we won't embarrass you. You don't have to say anything to anybody. We'll be here after the service. If you're uncomfortable coming up, you can grab one of us then. We'll be glad to talk to you. Others of you may be at a point you feel like the Holy Spirit is prompting you to respond, to put your faith in Christ, to be baptized into Him. We're ready to do that at any moment. We'd love to help you do that. We'd love to help you navigate what that looks like. Others of you may be here and you feel like the Lord is prompting you to join the team here at FCC. Maybe your membership is somewhere else and you feel like God has brought you here. And the question we sometimes get is, what do you have to do? Well, you don't have to do anything. If you're already a baptized believer, you just come up here and repeat the good confession, and we'll welcome you with open arms. There's no paperwork. There's no vote. None of that stuff. We just want you to know we want you on the team. So if you want to pray with somebody, if you want to talk to somebody, or you just want to pray by yourself, we'd be glad to help you.